is called Taking Leave, and this discusses our evolving relationship with our beloved departed. The questions we're going to address today: is death painful for souls? Is my presence felt when I visit a grave? We will discuss Judaism's pre-burial and burial rituals that accompany the soul's gradual transition from a limiting physical life to a completely spiritual one. These are some of the ideas that we're going to discuss today, and I welcome you all to today's lesson. So, if you've got a book, you can follow along. In this session, I'll read the texts just to keep it easy for everyone, especially those watching online. This chapter will explore what happens during the interval between the moment a person passes away and interment. While exploring the topic of interment, we will also examine the subject of grave visitation. A soul's departure from its body signals the onset of a new phase in its journey. It is no longer attached and tethered to the foreign world of materiality. The soul is now free to soar to its native habitat, the spiritual, heavenly realms. The question is, what significance does Judaism give to that fateful moment of transition? And we're going to look at two letters in the first section. You'll see them on the screen in a moment, by two Hasidic masters, along with an exploration. Apologies for those who see this stuck in your way. We're going to look at the two of the soul's 5 components. So over the coming weeks, we are going to explore the 5 components of the soul, and that will allow us to discover the ramifications that the moment of passing carries for the soul itself, as well as those it leaves behind. All right, first, it says in the Talmud, start with a milsa de b'dichusa, meaning a little bit of a humorous idea, because especially since this is a little bit of a morbid topic. So, the story goes that a rabbi went to his synagogue one morning and he discovered a dead mule in the yard. I heard the story happened in Europe or wherever. So he called the police, and since there didn't look like there was any foul play, the police referred the rabbi to the health department of their city. Well, they said that since there was no health threat, he should call the sanitation department, Pikitap. Well, the sanitation manager said he couldn't pick up the mule without the authorization from the mayor's office. So now the rabbi knew that their particular mayor was not eager to help out. Well, the mayor was known for his bad temper and was generally a hard person to deal with. But the rabbi called him anyway. And the mayor didn't disappoint. He immediately began to rant and rave. He says to the rabbi, "You know something? Why do you call me anyway? Isn't it your job to deal with the dead?" To which the rabbi replied, "Yes, Mayor, it's my job to bury the dead. But I always like to notify the next of kin first." Okay, with that in mind, let us begin today's lesson. We have 5 sections to today's lesson. In the first section, we are going to discuss the significance of the moment of a person's passing. So that is section number 1. Can you see it on the screen? It looks like the computer's a little bit slow here, but just bear with me. Section 2, we'll talk about the process of the soul's departure from the body. Then, in section 3 and section 4, we will deal with traditions, Jewish traditions that is, that surround the care of the body of the deceased, as well as the interment. And then we will get to section 5, where we'll deal with grave visitation. People wonder about that, when you can visit a grave, why don't we go in the first year, things like that, and there's a lot to discuss. I have to say that the introduction, the first section, is a little bit esoteric. But as we get through the lesson, we will get a little bit more practical. So bear with me as we deal with the esoteric. I'll try to summarize and make it make as much sense as possible for you. Each of these topics relate to the basic general theme of our lesson, which I told you is called taking leave. We're dealing with the continuing connection that we maintain with the deceased and the connection that our beloved departed maintains with us after their passing. Now, the soul's departure from the body, as we discussed last week, it signals a new beginning. The way secular society sees it is, it's an end, it's final, it's finished. But luckily, we have a spiritual perspective. And from a spiritual perspective, we don't see it as such. We realize it's the end of life only as we know it, but it's a new beginning for the soul, because the soul already existed before coming into this world, before birth, and the soul will continue to exist even after its termination in this physical world as it parts ways with the body. So while the body will be returned to the dust of the earth where it came from, the soul will continue. So it's just the onset of a new phase in the soul's journey. No longer is the soul attached and tethered to what might be a foreign world of physical materiality, but it is now free to soar in its native spiritual heavenly realms. And those realms we will explore, please God, next week. We'll discuss what happens, what goes on high, what happens in the celestial heavenly realm. But today, let's talk about what happens when the soul leaves the body. That is today's discussion. And we'll start off with a letter that was penned by the Alter Rebbe in 1788. It was sent to the Hasidim, who were mourning for the passing of one of his colleagues, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Haradach. Incidentally, my great-grandfather was also Rabbi David Menachem Mendel of Haradach. So I don't know if this is a relative or not, but I think Haradach is more of the city. Whether there's a connection or not, I don't know. But the idea is, in this letter, he tries to console the bereaved followers by explaining that their connection to their leader, to their teacher, to their Rebbe, is, yes, it is terminated in the physical sense, but not spiritually. They could actually keep that connection going. And so, before we go into the text, there's two terms that we need to familiarize ourselves with. One term is nefesh, the other is ruach, and we will explore both of those terms, what it means, the idea, what the idea of nefesh and ruach are. Maybe before we do that, let's try a little exercise, okay? Just to keep it a little interactive here. I know the participants online can't see and can't be part of this exercise, but for the rest of us, just to keep it a little bit, keep us awake. It's a cold day, we got to warm ourselves up. Let us do as follows. This half of the room are going to be, let's just try to think how to do this in a way. Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Haradach was a renowned teacher. Okay, he was a disciple of the Maggid of Mezrich, who was the successor of the Baal Shem Tov. And the Maggid of Mezrich, he actually gave all of his disciples to be rabbis and leaders, sort of in a way like the Rebbe sent shluchim all over the world. That's what Rabbi Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezrich, did. In fact, those who were here last week, you watched a video at some point towards the end of last week's class. We watched a video about the Maggid, how he didn't have much material possessions, furniture in his home. We showed you a video of the 8-day group performing that. I'll refresh your memory that this visitor asked the rabbi, Why do you live so bare? You don't have any furnishings. They asked him, where are your leather couches? Where are your golden chandeliers? Where are your walk-in closets? Right? And the rabbi asks him, where are yours? And he responded, what do you mean mine? I am just visiting. Right? I'm just passing through. Come to my house, you'll see what I got. To which the rabbi responded, I'm just like you, just passing through, just like you. So he says the same idea, I'm just traveling through. Okay, so that was Rabbi Dober Magid, the Magid of Mezrich. Now, his students loved him very, very much. And you can imagine how they felt, how grief-stricken they were when he passed away. I'm multitasking here, letting people in. Now, I want you guys to be the students of Rabbi Menachem Mendel when he passed away, right? They just suffered this tragedy of the passing of their teacher. He lived in Israel at this stage. And I want this side of the room to be the consolers, offering solace and comfort. The truth is, you could be either one. Anyone here want to be a comforter and share words of comfort? What would you say to these students when they lost their great rabbi? How would you comfort them?
The soul is going to go from one aliyah to another.
Tell them the soul is going to go on a great elevation. It's going to go on high. But how do they feel that they no longer have their rabbi, their teacher?
They need to go through a process of grief.
They go through a process of grief, okay? Any other points?
It doesn't happen all at the same time. It's a process.
There's a process. It happens gradually, okay? Very good. Any other points?
It's always with us. I could just say that as you lose someone physically.
It certainly is.
Look at the time that he spent with the students.
Yeah.
With the good things that he did. And we must do that.
Absolutely. We have to appreciate the time that we were privileged to have with them. Go ahead.
He's with us in spirit.
He's with us in spirit. Okay. Now, for those who are pretending to be the students, any of those ideas resonated with you or you felt perhaps somewhat comforted by them? No,
Not comforted.
not comforted.
No, because for all these very wise words, we're never going to see our teacher again in this lifetime. He's not going to be there.
Right. I hear you. You're saying we're no longer going to see them in the physical sense of this world. And I hear that point. Yeah?
We know that our teacher has gone to a higher level. But there is so much more he could have taught us. We've lost out.
Right. So these are all very good and valid points, and particularly now expressing why you're not necessarily comforted by this. And I can't say you're going to be comforted by this letter we're going to read together that the Alter Rebbe penned to them, because he does very much focus on the spiritual. And it's certainly true that the physical element is always going to be missing henceforth. And that's why we grieve. That is precisely why we grieve and we mourn when we lose someone, because it's true, we know they're in a better place and they're going to be in a spiritual high and their soul doesn't end, but still, we miss them. We will no longer experience that personal interaction that we have with them. And that's what the Alter Rebbe starts off talking about, the spiritual side. He describes how, according to our tradition, the human soul, which has 5 components, each one possessing its own name. There's nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, and yechida. And although in this letter he only touches on the first 2 levels, we'll discuss the other 5 next week. But generally speaking, the nefesh is that aspect, that soul component, that although it's spiritual, it is most connected to the physical. It provides physical life and powers all bodily function. Inside the book, you could see the little chart that shows that this is the side of the soul, the nefesh, that is connected to our physical, biological life. So that's the nefesh element. Let me see if I could put that on the screen so you can at least get a little two lowest levels of the soul that we're going to be discussing right now. Nefesh, which is connected to the physical life, and ruach, which is more, ruach could be defined as a spirit, but that's the emotional aspect, which is less tangible, less physical. Okay, so that's the two sides that we're discussing in this letter that we're going to read right now. And, once a person passes away, we're told the part of the soul that served its biological function, which is which part? Nefesh, very good. That remains in the grave with the body, whereas the ruach, the person's emotions and feelings, that ascends on high. Of course, there are 3 more levels as well, which also go on high, but we're not discussing those today, so we'll get back to those next week, please God. So, again, where are we up to now? What happens when the soul leaves the body? We're at that moment, and that calls for another story. My friend Moshe Schwartz, unfortunately, he wasn't well, and there he's lying in the hospital on his deathbed, and he's surrounded by his wife, and he's got his daughter and his 2 sons. They're all there with him. So he says to them, sadly, the time has come for my final instructions to you, my dear children. Bernie, he says to his son, I want you to take the Houghton route. The Houghton houses, sorry. Sybil, he says to his daughter, you take the apartments over in Berea. And to Sarah, my dear wife, I want you to take all the residential buildings in town. And then to his other son, Jaime, I want you to take the offices in the city center. The nurse, who is standing right next to him there, next to the bed, and she's overhearing this, she's blown away by all this. Houghton and Berea and the offices in the city center and all the apartments. She says, wow, this must be a really wealthy guy. I wonder why he's sitting here in a hospital in Joburg Gen. Anyways, she says to the wife, I'm assuming your husband, he must have been a very hard-working man to have accumulated all these properties. To which Mrs. Schwartz tells the nurse, no, that's his newspaper route. All right, ladies and gents, let's go into the text. Let's read this letter here. And actually, I'm not going to read the letter inside. For those who have it, you could read it. I'm going to put the letter on the screen just so those following along can follow along in the text, but I'm not going to read the full letter inside because, as you know, in these classes and the limited time we have, we don't get through all the texts. I'm going to only do shorter texts inside, and we'll just look at this letter outside. But the idea that's discussed here is how the nefesh, which remains in the grave with the body, unlike the ruach, which ascends on high to Gan Eden, what is its connection? Well, in this letter, the Alter Rebbe is writing to these Chassidim and saying, as you know, your teacher was a holy man. He was a tzaddik. And for a tzaddik, when they pass away, they are no longer confined to the body. They're no longer confined to the physical. And he quotes here, as you can see, reading on the screen, what the Gemara says in Talmud, Tractate Avodah Zarah 5b, that this very idea that he quotes here, the inability to receive directly from the Ruach, and therefore our sages stated that it takes 40 years for a student to fully plumb the depths of his master's teachings. He goes on here in this letter, the basic idea that's discussed, and I'll leave it on the screen for a little bit for those who want to read along, is that a tzaddik, a righteous person, their life is a whirlwind of love, of reverence, of faith, and that transcendent lifestyle that they live is connected to the ruach element. Remember, the emotions of a person. And as long as a person is alive, the ruach, that aspect of the soul, is confined in the person, right? Can only be expressed through the nefesh, through the bodily expression of a person. So the people with whom one comes in contact can never truly relate to the essence of a person's attributes, right? And now the point that he mentions from the Talmud is at least, for 40 years of toil, that you have to connect to the teacher. I'm not exactly sure I fully understand exactly what the Talmud means by that, but we do know this concept, why a person doesn't study Zohar, Kabbalah, until age 40, is because they need to be fully developed to maturely cultivate their mind to connect with these deep ideas. So we're saying it takes 40 years to connect with the intellect of one's teacher. We're talking here about great people, but this concept of a tzaddik, as those who were here yesterday know, a tzaddik is not just limited to great, holy, spiritual people. It's not just your rabbi or rebbitzin. Each one of us can attain a level of tzaddik, of living a meaningful and purposeful life that is righteous and pious. True, it is the holy and pure individuals who might reach certain elevated states, but as long as we abstain from our lusts and desires, from negativity, and we try to live in sync with our mission and purpose, and each one of us has our own unique mission and purpose in this world, then we are living the lifestyle, the idea, the purpose of a tzaddik. So the idea then is, when the physical avenues of connection are shut off, when a person passes on, the possibility of spiritual connection is not severed, God forbid. The idea we're expressing is that it becomes stronger and deeper than before. Now, again, as you said, we no longer have the physical presence of our beloved departed. But we have to know that spiritual connection always remains, and this is something that's expressed in our next text. But let's just put this idea over here. A tzaddik's life, a righteous person's life, from a spiritual perspective, is an individual who is connected, who is in tune with their purpose and mission, by being people who live in tune with faith, with reverence, with love. And in their lifetime, it is limited to expressions through the nefesh, through their physical well-being. But when they pass on from this world, we say that true power is unleashed, and they are able to now connect with us deeper than before. And it's not limited to being in their physical presence. So maybe when we talk about connecting with it, it's not when a person is alive in this world, you have to be in their presence to connect with them truly and fully. Yes, you could connect maybe virtually in other ways. What we're saying is, when they pass on, that connection is not limited to the physical. Okay, again, it's a spiritual answer. It is true that we will forever mourn and not have that physical presence with them. But from a spiritual perspective, we're saying that it's no longer limited to the nefesh element. Now, the ruach, that spiritual element which was previously confined only to their physical body, is unleashed. And that is an idea that's expressed in our next text, which is a letter written by the Rebbe, 1983. And you know what? Let's read this letter together. All right. So I'm going to put it on the screen. We'll read the letter together, and then we'll unpack it. We will try to analyze it. So this letter, in this course, we're giving every text a title, a name. So it sort of summarizes the idea that's expressed here. This letter, we're calling it a soul, a spirit unshackled. Okay. He says as follows: it is also a matter of common sense that whatever the direct cause of the separation of the soul and body, right, God forbid, maybe someone was in a fatal accident, or maybe they were severely ill, it could affect only any of the vital organs of the physical body, but could in no way affect the spiritual soul. So that's our first paragraph in short. Death only affects the physical body. Let's continue reading the letter. A further point, which is also understandable, is that during the soul's lifetime on earth, in partnership with the body, the soul is necessarily handicapped in certain respects by the requirements of the body, such as eating and drinking. Even a tzaddik whose entire life is consecrated to Hashem, to God, cannot escape the restraints of life in a material and physical environment. Consequently, when the time comes for the soul to return home, it is essentially a release for it as it makes its ascent to a higher world, no longer restrained by a physical body and physical environment. Henceforth, the soul is free to enjoy the spiritual bliss of being near to Hashem in the fullest measure. So, in that sense, death frees the soul. Now, I know this is, again, spiritual ideas, which is why we have a video here which will use the psychological idea of inattentional blindness to illustrate this idea and the ideas that follow. So, ladies and gents, I'm going to turn off my screen and I will.
How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear? That's what psychologists call inattentional blindness. And no, it is not a condition to be concerned about. In fact, life would be impossible without it. Let me explain. As powerful as the human brain may be, it is easily overwhelmed by the sheer onslaught of observation, calculation, sight, sound, and signals that envelop our every waking hour. The brain cannot permit itself to register and record each image and movement, every message and stimulation. Instead, our brains and nervous systems aggressively filter and limit our intake to manageable levels. The result? We notice a fraction and ignore the fullness, and remember far less. Often, we purposely engage in what cognitive neuroscientists call selective attention, like focusing on a dinner partner in a crowded restaurant, while tuning out all other conversations in the room. Now imagine that you had the ability to absorb everything around you, to absorb, comprehend, and recall all the details, and fetch every memory at will, without being overwhelmed. That is the incredible experience of the human soul, once it detaches from the body at the close of a lifetime. Unshackled from the frailties of a nervous system, unrestricted by networks of neurons, it is unbelievably free and powerfully present. It is free to absorb truths that mortal minds cannot contain, present to delight in the divine radiance that courses through the cosmos, to bask in divine understanding that supersedes human senses, but is savored by the newly liberated soul.
So, I think the idea that we're trying to articulate, to express here is that our feelings are limited by our physical bodies, right? Even vis-a-vis ourselves, as the video tried to express, right? The physical heart is incapable of processing and experiencing emotions on their essential level. What we experience is a watered down version of those soulful feelings. So once the spirit, the ruach, departs the body, then it's revealed. It's free to experience itself in a deeper way than ever before. Now, the emotions we experience while still alive maybe are comparable to watching something, an HD, a high definition video on a device that's not equipped to play high definition footage. So even though you might be experiencing it, you're not experiencing it to the fullest degree. And it's this heightened level of self that others can also tap into after a person's passing. As the Zohar says, it radiates downward in a manifest way from above. So our emotions, as we described here, are limited by our physical bodies when we are alive. It's only afterwards that we get the juice, the full experience, so to say. Now, it's true that it's going to be lacking a different experience. Like these oranges, when you take them out of the peel, you're getting a juice, but you're no longer going to have the same experience as, it's I don't know if it's a great example, but the point I'm making is that we're trying to explain why on a mystical level, the moment of a person's passing is highly significant. At that moment, the person's spiritual energy is unleashed. No longer are they tethered to the material container. They're revealed to itself, and those that love them, they connect now on a deeper level. So yes, this idea still doesn't answer the lack of physical presence, because that's what we're still going to mourn. I see you're a little bit too serious right now, so time for another story. Beryl was an old man, and he's breathing his last breath there at Mill Park Clinic. He could barely see, but he could still hear. Maisha, he says, are you here? Yes, Tati, I'm here. Jack, are you here? Yes, Dad, I'm here. Sarah, are you here? Of course, Papa. Zelig, how about you? I'm here, Dad. So tell me, Kinderlach, who in the world is watching the business? Okay, the idea, of course, that we're trying to express here is that these qualities of the soul are eternal. The soul is immortal, and therefore it's infinite. And from that perspective, even after a person's passed on from this world, not only are they accessible, but I think the idea that was expressed was they're even more accessible. All our holy and beautiful ideals, our feelings, our emotions, those principles, the values that we held so important to us, those are rooted in the ruach element of our soul. Again, next week we'll discuss the 5 levels of soul a little bit deeper. But what we're saying here is that when a loved one passes on, these ideals, these feelings, these principles, they don't vanish, they don't disappear. Everything you worked so hard to achieve, yes, you don't take your money with you. Excuse me, we don't take our gadgets with us. But the morals, those concepts, those are actually intensified and are accessible to those who love that person and want to connect to that person through love. And the more we love, the more we connect. And when we connect, we are connecting to the deepest part of our loved one. So maybe that's why after a person passes on, we tend to have a greater appreciation for them, and maybe we remember more their noble good qualities. We read a few weeks ago in Vayikra the portions of Achrei Mot, which deals with the passing of the sons of Aaron, or after their passing. And then the portion of Kedoshim, where God tells us to be holy. And then the portion of Emor, which has a lot of the sacrifices and the festivals. But there's an expression, Achrei Mot Kedoshim Emor. After a person dies, we miss them. We talk about the holiness, about how good they were. Whereas in the lifetime, perhaps we have our faribbles and differences. Now, of course, practically, excuse me, practically speaking, absence and yearning make the heart fonder, right? The lack of exposure to a person's less than perfect side, helps us remember and miss all that which we loved about them. But the spiritual root of this phenomenon may be the fact that a person's positive qualities are more revealed and intensified to us after their passing. And this is something that Kabbalah, Hasidus describes. So clearly, the moment that a person passes on, which is what we're discussing in today's lesson, taking leave, their nearest and dearests are not in a state of celebrating that spiritual milestone, even though, as we said in last lesson, in a sense, there's something to celebrate, because we could look back and see the meaningful, purposeful life they lived. Unlike when a person's born, it seems like the opposite. When a person's born, we don't know what their life will lead to. We celebrate the child's birth, but do we know what's going to be with that child? How they'll turn out? Like the ships that the Talmud remarks about. The boats would go on a journey. Do we know what will be with that boat? Will its passengers reach their destination? Will the cargo, the merchandise on this ship, go to where it needs to? Will it be attacked by pirates? Will it hit an iceberg? We don't know. When it reaches its destination, we could celebrate. And in that sense, the Gemara says, that's what we should be doing when a person completes their life in this world. We realize that we can have a much deeper connection with them that's no longer limited by the physicality. Yet, of course, we understand that we're not in a state of celebrating. When do we celebrate? On a yard site. On a yard site. Now time has passed, a year has gone by, more years have gone by. We realize, as you said before, there's the aliyah, the soul reaching its higher levels. Then perhaps we're more in a state of mind that we could celebrate. We'll get to that in a few weeks' time, discussing yard sites. But at the time that a person passes on, even though now in theory we could discuss this idea that we know they're in a better place, it's not an easy thing for us to, at the time, and in fact it is crass, it is wrong to not mourn, even though there's theoretically something to celebrate. So that difficult moment when it seems that this person is disconnected from us and we have no more connection with them, it's actually a moment that has the potential to intensify all the existing relationships. That's why we're reading and discussing these ideas now, when, thank God, we're in a good state and place, when we're not mourning. So we can at least have that concept in the back of our minds, when, God forbid, those times come in the cycle of life where we lose our loved ones. And that's what we read in our first text. The Alter Rebbe explains that to be in touch with the deceased, we need to feel love for the deceased. We need to tap into these qualities in our lifetime. And that's why those who were deeply connected are the ones who mourn the most. A true loving relationship demands that we relate to and meet another person on their terms. Think about a parent relates to the different levels of a child. To a toddler, it's one way, right? A little kid, you're going to play with them, coochie coochie coo, right? And obviously that's not going to work for a 5-year-old who perhaps wants you to read them Cat in the Hat and play catch with them or whatever they want. And when they get a little bit older, I think I got kids in all the different stages. At 11, you're playing something a little bit more intellectually stimulating or a little bit more challenging. You're not going to make them win the game every time. Even if you do, you're going to make it a little harder competition. And when they're teenagers, right? So the relationship is constantly evolving based on the needs of the individual. So when a person passes away, many of those things that interested them beforehand no longer are meaningful to them at this stage. If we want to continue the relationship, then we are challenged to meet them in their new state. And that is by becoming more spiritually attuned. And when we do so, we connect in a profoundly meaningful way. Psychologists have even embraced this continuing relationship with deceased. They call it continuing bonds. So that is a concept in modern psychology. Certainly, relationships are not easy to maintain in our lifetime. And as you can see, according to Jewish mysticism, even after our lifetime. So what I want to do with you now, my friends, is to take a moment. We're going to put our pens down. If you want, you could take some notes. But as we did last week, we're going to have a meditative moment. We're going to close the lights. And wherever you are, you could join along. The video, the meditation will be narrated by Rabbi Shais Taub. Some of you are familiar with him. He's been out here to speak on a few occasions. And he will take us on a meditation where we will visualize a 2-story home to allow us to envision the idea of a deceased, departed loved one being so near while still not being visible, while not being seen. So,
welcome to our meditation reflection for Lesson 2 of Journey of the Soul. We're going to try to visualize and relate to the idea of the continuing connection between those who are still inhabiting this world and their loved ones who have moved on. How can we visualize this connection? So I want to share with you a metaphor that was given by the Lubavitcher Rebbe to a grieving family when they lost their dear mother. The Rebbe told the family, you should know that your loved one, when they pass away, hasn't gone to some faraway place. Really, what is the situation? It's as if the whole family is together on the first floor of the house, and this loved one is in the same house with you on the second floor. So we're going to try to visualize. Again, if it helps you to close your eyes, you can close your eyes. If you want to leave your eyes open, leave your eyes open. But start to visualize in your mind's eye a loved one who's passed on. Try to imagine what it was like when you would gather and that person was physically with you. Try to remember the sights, the sounds, the whole setting. And now, imagine that exact same gathering, same setting, and that loved one who's passed on is still there with one difference. They're on the second floor. Take a moment to imagine the feeling. It's hard to describe it, but if we envision it, we may be able to feel it. What does it feel like? The knowledge that this loved one, you may not be able to see them, but they're right there, very, very close by, in the same house, where the family is together, everyone is there, and the only difference is they're upstairs, they're on the second floor. Let's try to envision, let's try to visualize a loved one. Try to remember what it was like when they were on the first floor. And now think about the exact same setting. What does it feel like? What does it feel like knowing that they're on the second floor? They're with us. They're with us. They're in the same house. They're only just a few feet away. Not far, far, far away. Very close by, on the second floor. Take a half a minute to visualize and try to connect to this feeling of the loved one on the second floor.
Okay, we can wake up now from our meditation, and I hope this gives you a little perspective of the mystical idea of how, although we're no longer physically in contact, but we realize that from a spiritual perspective, that relationship is never truly terminated and severed. On the contrary, we're saying that it is a deeper relationship. Now, of course, the moments before a person's passing can be very difficult. It could be difficult in many ways. Emotionally, we talked last week about putting our fears in place, about knowing that we want that whatever unfinished business matters, whatever things have to be sorted, that we take care of those things. But let's discuss now the spiritual side and how to deal with. So there's a lot to discuss, and there's many websites. We've summarized it here for you. There's a lot of medical literature about the importance of how to treat emotional pain and suffering at the end of life. And here are just a few points, because as we introduced today's class, we talked about the spiritual separation. And now we're moving on to the practical aspects of losing a loved one, of what happens then. It's a very distressful time. So here's a few points. Firstly, we mentioned open communication, maybe reminiscing family memories, good times. Try to focus on the good. I know I was sitting with one couple, and he said to her, "Oh, honey, you've been at my side through this roller coaster of life." She says, "Yes, you haven't missed a single bump." Focus on the positive. It's not a time it's as it is anxious, and time to focus more on the positive things. And it tells the person, reminds them that their life was well lived if we could focus on the positive. I know perhaps because I'm a rabbi, I face this a lot more than you do. But at the end of the day, a true caring friend, if you're there with a loved one at a time of their departure from this world, we never know when we'll be called in that duty. And at least these are some tips and ideas of how to be with them. So the first one, again, is that open communication, reminiscing. It's hard. I could tell you this one is not an easy one. I usually don't like to even address the inevitable. But we're going to talk now about saying the final prayer, vidoy. It's appropriate to be said. And therefore one has to be frank and honest in that sense. But a good way of connecting is with physical contact, touching and holding hands, giving them a pat on the back, holding onto their, just being physically present in that sense can be very soothing. Then we talk about the state of the room. It may be that it's chaotic, especially if it's in a hospital or in a hospice. So perhaps it's not a good idea to have a lot of noise and talking and activity. As it is, there's beeping from the machinery. To try to just be present. He doesn't have to be talking, even just simply being there. The greatest present we could give others is our presence. And let me tell you, one of the most dangerous things, lethal, that we have these days is our phones. And I talk about myself here. Let's think about practically when we're sitting with each other. Are we absent-minded? Are we on our phones, distracted by messages? Well, particularly when we're dealing at those moments at the end of a person's life. One of the greatest gifts we could give them is our presence. Just being there. Some places talk about setting a comforting atmosphere could be very helpful, right? Music therapy, maybe putting on their favorite music. Usually you want to set the mood, make it relaxing. That could lessen a person's pain according to some theories. They mention here various contemporary articles, because I don't know to what degree one was able to offer music in previous centuries, but today it's certainly easy to do so on our devices. So it could certainly, here's an interesting quote. Music therapy with imminently dying patients may include techniques to facilitate pain control, help provide physical and emotional comfort, assist in relaxation, and reduce anxiety. So that's a quote from the American Journal of Hospice and Palliative Care. Okay, I just have it here in my text in front of me. So, based on what we just learned, you might imagine that the soul would be happy to separate from the body, to be free, right? To completely move on from this world where it's untethered, where it's uninhibited by the physical constraints and limitations, because as we said at the beginning of today's lesson, that then the soul gets to go on high. It's free. Where all the pain and the suffering is a distant memory. But yet, I want you to turn to text 2, where the Zohar tells us otherwise. That as much as the transition to the next world, and the next world might be a very spiritual and blissful place. Last week we showed the Mishnah that tells us that it is this world where all the good we get to achieve happens. Well, here's something interesting from the Zohar. The Zohar says nothing is as hard for the soul as its separation from the body. That is the most painful moment. Now, why would the death be difficult and painful for the soul? I understand for us, when we lose our loved one, we're in pain because we feel that finality. We're not in tune with this spiritual connection that we're going to have with them going forward, if we only think of things in physical terms. But why is it difficult for the soul? So let's address that. Firstly, death is that ultimate transition. And transitions always are difficult, even if they're necessary and positive ones. Think of any new situation you've been in, right? A kid going to school, new comfort, new routine, new schedule. They're not used to it. Think about a new job you may have had, moving into a retirement facility, whatever it might be. When we have changes in family and environment, we are creatures of habit. So we create our habitat and we fill it with our habits, both good ones and not good ones. Habits are, there are lots of good habits we have, and that's good. But it's frightening to go from what we know, even if it's imperfect, to that which we don't know. And since we're not familiar, even though our soul was once there before, but the soul knows it's no longer able to do that which was here, right? Before it was in this world, and maybe it was kicking and fighting and screaming before coming in this world, like when my parents wanted to take me on that holiday in 1991. I'll never forget it. I've told some of you. My parents, I was in camp then, a day camp, and we were going to Six Flags Great Adventures for our final trip. This was end of August, 91. We're going on this big trip, and I was very excited about it, but my mother woke me up at 6 o'clock when the bus was already leaving, 6 a.m. And I was upset, and I threw a tantrum. She didn't give me the camp t-shirt. I wanted the camp t-shirt because I wanted to go on the trip. And my mother says, no, we're going on a different trip today. We're going to a resort in the Catskill Mountains. And I said, no, I don't want to go. Anyways, eventually, after kicking and screaming and fighting, I went into the car and probably had my mad face for some time. And then we got to this resort, and even though at first I was upset because I wanted to be at Six Flags Great Adventures, But then I started to really like it. And it was great. And in fact, after a few days when my parents said, trip is over, we're going home, I didn't want to go home. I liked it at the resort, and now I threw another tantrum. And I was right, because when we came back home to Brooklyn, unfortunately, there was a tragic incident that day in our neighborhood where one of the people in the motorcade that would escort the Rebbe back from the resting place of his father-in-law and his wife in Queens, the Rebbe would visit the resting place of his wife after she passed away a few times a week, maybe even daily at some stage, until that's where he had his stroke, and that led to his passing in 1994. So the Rebbe would go there every day. This is 1991. And there was a whole motorcade. There were many Hasidim who liked to follow along, and there was a police escort. One of the cars that was behind, likely, possibly wanting to follow up, be closer to the Rebbe, I think it ran a yellow or a red light, and unfortunately struck a child, a Caribbean kid in the street, and it led to chaos, led to riots. What was a car accident? Maybe negligence of the driver, I don't know. But unfortunately, it led to retaliation of the murder of a rabbi in the community that day. And it was very sad and tragic, and we had to stay locked up at home. I said, let's go back to the resort. And my parents were like, yeah? Now you want to go back there? You put up a whole fight last week. And of course, I'm using this little personal anecdote to illustrate that when we go, every transition is difficult. But besides for the transition, there's also the aspect of the mitzvahs, the good deeds that we were able to achieve, the good we're able to do in this world before leaving. So it's difficult for the soul to separate all transitions, even necessary and positive ones, as we say, are hard, and that's difficult for the soul. And the second idea, which we expressed more last week, is the idea why Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, if you recall, was sad when he was leaving, and a student said to him, why are you crying, our rabbi? Right? And he said, isn't it a good thing you're going to the heavenly realm? And he said, I'm not crying about where I'm going, but I'm crying about what I'm leaving. Why are my slides not working? Just a second, let me see what's going on. Why are the slides not moving? Let's see if we can move them. Okay, there we go. Tried moving the slides a few times. They should be working now. Okay, so that's the second point, because it's not only about where we're going, but it's also about what we're leaving behind. And that's the mitzvahs, the good deeds we could do in this world. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, I shouldn't say most importantly, but the point is that the soul enters this world on a mission. To fulfill that mission here, we have a divine purpose and mission, and the soul and body have to be integrated in order for that to be achieved. And this means that the soul is with the body and it experiences all its earthly pursuits, all the ups and downs. And just as the soul influences the body and the world and the body actually influence and impact the soul. So to a degree, the soul becomes attached to its earthly surroundings, and of course, that makes it somewhat a difficult bond to sever, to break. Imagine the people, the connections, which is what we said at the beginning, why, as true as all these ideas are, why it's still difficult for us to part ways. Yes?
In your experience, when you are dying, do you find that they are anxious, fearful, what are they, to that extent, more spinal nerves, more receptive to signs, and sad that they're leaving behind people? These ideas of quantum is what, and so on, are quite spiritual ideas. But at the end of the day, it's the people and the relationships that you separate.
Yeah.
In that sense. So how do you find the dying person feel if they're articulate, not obviously to be?
So I've been with many people, and my experience, maybe one day I could write a book, but I find the experiences vary. It's different. Usually I would say I haven't found anybody happy to go. I was with somebody 2 weeks ago who told me he just can't handle suffering and pain anymore. I actually have heard that many times from people, but in a sad way. They realize they're going to miss this world, and they're worried about their family. In most cases, I would find people are more worried. About being anxious, that interestingly, I can't say I haven't really done an assessment in my mind, but I've found, at least in the most recent people I've been with on the day of the passing, I've been with numerous people the day they passed away, and conscious and involved, because what I encourage, now that I'm a little bit more experienced, I encourage families to call me when that time is coming, while the person's still conscious and available and able to speak, and we could say final prayers and we could talk together, because better to do it when a person's conscious and able to do so. And I found, firstly, I found many people to be in a relaxed state. I've come to terms with it at that stage, and they haven't been anxious. At least the final people I've been with. Right, the last person I was with, he wanted to go. He said he needs to finish. Promise me you'll be there connected with my kids, and promise me there'll still be a connection. But he wanted to go because he was just suffering too much. But I have found most of the people have not been as anxious as I would have expected. So I think maybe because all these people I've been with are elder and were ill for some time. I haven't been, okay, God forbid, when tragedies happen, then there's no preparation, and that's why it's saddest. I mentioned in the past, my mother passed away fairly young, just at 60, and we had time to prepare because she was ill for that long. Whereas my father-in-law was struck in a car accident, and there was no time to prepare. So the grief was different for my wife and I and our siblings, just because of that suddenness of it. But it's still, still sad, still tragic, still difficult to accept. But that's for the mourners. For the deceased themselves, like I said, I'm mostly dealing with elderly people who are sort of aware, and I found that I haven't found the anxiety, but I haven't seen anybody really be happy to go. Maybe happy to end their suffering, but not like joyous. And maybe we see here in the text we read last week in the Gemara about Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, a great teacher, thinker who gave us the Mishnah. He compiled the entire Mishnah, the oral law, and he was not happy to go. And he said because he knows he's going to a better place. But when you're going to a better place and when you realize what you're leaving behind, especially what he could have achieved, he says, all the mitzvahs I could still do, I'll no longer be able to do in the next world. And I find that very similar to many people that I interact with, that part is sad to them, to leave their loved ones. There is a book that was written by a nurse in palliative care, I think in Australia. I think she has the 50 top last requests or something by dying patients that she interacted with. It's an interesting book to read. I once read it years ago. And interestingly, nobody says they wish they spent more time in the office. And more people wish they spent more time with their family. And so something that we could reflect on when we discuss these ideas about, I think a lot of what we're discussing here informs a lot about life, how we could live more meaningfully and purposefully here, so that we know that we leave this world without remorse, without regrets, that we lived purposefully. So in that sense, the soul, which is attached to the body, and that until it's reunited with the resurrection, there is that aspect that the soul feels bad to leave. So now we'll go into the period of mourning itself, because the next texts will take us through the various stages of mourning. So I put all the texts right here. We're going to look at them on the board very quickly, briefly. The first text talks about the first 3 days after a person passes away. This is the Gemara in it's Talmud Yerushalmi, Moed Katan. The Mishnah here says that for 3 days the soul hovers above the body, thinking that it can return to it. After 3 days, when it sees that the body's face has changed, it leaves the body and departs. I guess there's sort of that realization process. Now, for the mourners as well, the first 3 days are a more difficult stage of mourning. People are in denial, they're angry, they're upset. So, in that sense, if we think about this, we'd think that the soul would immediately fly to the celestial heights, right? Thinking about what's in the next world. But again, I think this expresses how important, how precious the body is to the soul, how integral it is to its mission, and why it's difficult for that separation. The soul does not want to abandon the body. And actually, that's why we discuss here the various stages of the soul's departure. So that is text 3. Let's look at text 4a, b, and c. 4a, which is from the Zohar, it says here how the soul mourns the body for 7 days. The soul goes from the house where it lived to the grave, and from the grave back to the house, and it mourns its body. Again, it's illustrating the idea how important they were to each other. Text 4b talks about the concept of shloshim, 30 days, that the soul remains here for 30 days. The soul and the body are judged as one, and thus the soul is located down here on earth. After that, the soul ascends while the body erodes in the earth. So again, this is expressing this idea that it's a gradual process of separation. And the final stage, this is 4c from the Gemara, Tractate Shabbos. So the Gemara says how the soul ascends and descends for 12 months, that it's an entire process of elevation. So we have here 4 sources in front of us, each saying that the soul leaves at a different time, after 3 days, 7 days, 30 days, 12 months, and that there are these ideas that the soul and the body, the ruach, the nefesh, this whole gradual process of separation. So everything that we discuss here today connects to the central idea of the soul's continuing connection to us, to this world, to the love, to the people that it had a connection with, and our connection to them as well. And this posthumous connection is, as you could see in these texts, you could see that there's, at least for the first year, and certainly even going forward, there's always a connection there. And this we see as well in the mourning period that we experience, the Jewish laws of mourning, how it connects with this concept. First, we'll look at 2 more texts that discuss the mourning process, how we're meant to mourn, text 5 and text 6. Text 5 is Maimonides, the laws of mourning. And he talks about mourners observe 3 days of weeping. Okay, these are the stages corresponding to the stages of departure that we read in the previous text. And then for 30 days, restrictions on haircuts, not wearing freshly ironed clothing. Right? This is not a time to focus on vanity, on marrying, which is a separate, deeper halachic discussion, who can and who can't marry, not going to joyous events, not traveling on business. So as we could see, Jewish law tells us that the mourning, it's more intense at the beginning and it gradually decreases in intensity. We cry for 3 days, we eulogize. What happens during Shiva? We talk about the qualities, the goodness of the deceased. And then, slowly a person reemerges into society after Shiva. And throughout the year, there are various practices of mourning. The next text, text 6, is from Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law. And it says here, if you encounter an acquaintance within 30 days of the person having lost the next of kin. So you can see here how it's gradually moving on, right? Then what does it say? Let's read it. Just make sure I can see properly. Offer words of consolation and avoid the customary pleasantries. If 30 days have elapsed since the relative's passing, greet your acquaintance in the usual manner and offer indirect words of consolation. Avoid mentioning the deceased by name and extend a generic consolation such as, may you be comforted. If your acquaintance is mourning the loss of a parent, you should offer direct messages of comfort for the first 12 months, and only after that scale it back to indirect consolation. Again, use your common sense as well. And different people might handle things differently. So we'll talk more about that next week's lesson. We'll discuss these stages of mourning and the practices related to them in greater detail more next week. But for today, let's discuss these stages that the Talmud and the Zohar that we read, that discusses the phases of mourning, that it's a process. that reflects the distinct stages in the departure of the soul from the body. And our degree of mourning mirrors the degree of struggle that the soul experiences in the process of its ascent above to the heavenly realm. Okay, when we mourn, we are actually mourning not only for the deceased, but this is something interesting the Gemara tells us, we mourn with the deceased. And that's an important point to bear in mind, because we share in their pain. We empathize with them. That connection we have with them continues. And maybe that's why when we are offering words of comfort, what are the Hebrew words we say? Hamakim menachem etchem. When I read this was something of an interesting observation to me, because honestly, until recently, whenever I would comfort an individual, I would change it to the singular. I would say Hamakim menachem otach or otcha, depending if it's male or female.
Can you just translate?
May the Almighty comfort you amongst the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. Now, in English, you is singular and plural. But in Hebrew, there is a singular version which changes if it's male or female, masculine or feminine, and if it's plural or singular. So it's interesting that it says you always use the plural expression. And why would you always use the plural expression? Because you're also comforting the deceased, the soul. That's interesting, and that is not something I was actually aware of before preparing for today's lesson. So, the idea... we missed the text here. Okay, I'm going to go back. I'm going to forward, and then we'll go back to here, because I see that I put in a... Okay, no, we're in the right place. We could look at it here. Okay, so we said it corresponds as 4 stages of mourning. And as we mentioned here, the 4 stages of mourning connect with the stages of the soul's ascent above. So, as you saw, the first 3 days correspond with the soul's hovering. It's got to do with the degree of the soul's struggle in its ascent above. And so we don't just mourn for the soul, but we mourn with the soul. Let's move on to text 7 now. This is from the Gemara tractate Shabbos. Let's see what the Gemara says. How if the deceased leaves nobody behind, right? Sometimes that happens where there's no mourners, no children, sometimes no siblings, no relatives. I've been in such cases. In such instances, we have all the more so a mitzvah to be involved. And a case that happened this week. My wife's family, my wife and her siblings, when they were younger, there was a woman who moved from Vancouver to New York. This was a woman who was blind. She did not have visual ability from the age of 18 till almost 60. And then she came to New York and she moved in our neighborhood. That itself was quite a story, because although she was Jewish, since she had this condition, she wound up in a Christian healthcare center, and she basically was living a non-Jewish life. And then, because she wasn't able to see, she couldn't read anymore, so we'd bring her audiobooks. And in 1995, Rabbi Simon Jacobson wrote a book called Toward a Meaningful Life, which was a compilation of many of the Rebbe's teachings. And she got that book on tape, and it sparked her soul, and she decided to want to reconnect, and she wound up moving to New York. And because she was visually impaired, she couldn't see, she wound up having high school students, and my wife and her siblings helping her out. And the story goes how she one day read a letter from the Rebbe. She would have people read her letters of the Rebbe. And they read a letter where the Rebbe was blessing somebody for their eyesight, and she took it as a sign. And she went to meet with a doctor, and the doctor had very hefty fees. And one of my sisters-in-law, the youngest one, Michal, she did a collection in her classroom to pay for those fees, and I don't remember how much they collected, but it certainly wasn't enough to pay for this doctor's bill. And the doctor was so touched by the story that these high school girls collected a few $100s to pay for her medical expenses, and the doctor, I think, said, "You keep this money to get by, I will do this procedure for free." And what they realized was that she actually wasn't blind, although she was misdiagnosed when she was 18, and it was some kind of cataract disease, and nearly 40 years later, they actually were able to operate and remove that visual impairment, and she had her eyesight restored. You're talking about a woman who for nearly 40 years could not see. And she wrote a column in a magazine. My mother used to love reading her columns. I think she started writing it before her eyesight was restored, and it was called something like Beyond What the Eye Could See. And then when she wrote about this journey of her restoration of her eyesight, she described how, it's amazing what people don't wear anymore. Just a very interesting article. She passed away this past Sunday. Of course, we're here, so we couldn't be there, but she was never married. She didn't have children. I don't know if she had siblings. And her parents are long deceased. She was a lady in her late 80s now. And it was the community. And it was amazing to see pictures in our family WhatsApp group of people who came to her funeral to give her that final farewell. So we're going to read the text now that tells us of the importance of that, about mourning with the unmourned. This text says as follows. Again, the Gemara tells us if a person dies and leaves no next of kin to be comforted, 10 people should go and sit in the deceased home. Again, it's very interesting why it says that there are no mourners as opposed to saying that there are no avelim. Avelim would be no like children or no family members, because the issue is not that no one is there to mourn, but that the deceased has no one to come and comfort her, and therefore uses the term no mourners. Very interesting. Okay, so the Gemara tells a story here. A man died in Rabbi Yehuda's neighborhood. As there were no mourners to be comforted, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the compiler, the author of the Mishnah, he assembled 10 people every day, and they sat in the deceased home. After 7 days, the dead man appeared to Rabbi Yehuda in a dream and said, "May your mind be at rest, for you have set my mind at rest." So if we are to understand the function of Shiva, that it's just an expression of the mourner's grief and pain, then this story doesn't really make sense. If there's no one feeling pain, then why the need for a Shiva home? Why did Rabbi Yehuda assemble these people to go to the house? Right? Why should the soul be so touched by this gesture that he comes in a dream and he tells the rabbi, "Thank you for putting my mind at rest"? So, and very interestingly, Rambam says that comforting the mourners takes precedence over visiting the ill, because comforting mourners constitutes gemilas chasadim to both the living and the departed. Whereas when we're just visiting a sick person, then it's only one, in a sense. Of course, ideally we should be there for everyone and anyone. But we're talking about here, making a minyan in the home of the deceased, that the soul also is comforted by our consolation. So Shiva is also about the soul's pain. And that's why it's important that regardless of whether there are mourners, that during Shiva, we try to do things, and during the year, to make sure somebody says Kaddish for such a person. And that's why we say the mourners share the soul's pain. That when we're comforting somebody, we're bringing solace, not just to the children, the siblings, the parents, whoever it is, the friends, but also to the soul itself, that the soul of the deceased is also being comforted. All right, there's a lot more to talk about. I'm going to try to put a little bit of speed in here. I hope we're all learning. And the idea that the deceased remains very much spiritually alive and connected to those who loved and cherished them during their lifetime, we see it's actually expressed in the Jewish funeral tradition. How we do things at funerals. Okay? Because what is the Hebrew word for a funeral? Levaya. What does Levaya actually mean? Doesn't mean funeral. That's the colloquial word. Levaya means to escort, to comfort. Okay, somebody, when we talk about funerals, I have to remind you, I have a friend who tells me that when he was younger, he was a bachelor. He didn't get married, and whenever he would be at weddings, his older aunts and uncles would poke at him and say, "Imet Hashem, soon by you, Imet Hashem, soon by you." And he says, he got them to stop. Whenever we go to funerals with them, he'd poke them and go, soon by you, soon by you. Okay, they stopped poking him. All right, but that's the Hebrew meaning of the word levaya means, what does levaya mean? To escort. Halvayat amet means to escort the dead. That means, that's why. That's interesting. It's different here than in other places overseas. Because here, the whole entire procession takes place at the cemetery. So the Jewish custom in Joburg, at West Park, and I think throughout South Africa, we have a unique community that follows Jewish traditions. Those who were here at a previous year where I described a particular funeral I did in New York, where they basically eschewed, they removed all our traditions. It's in such bad taste, they don't realize the richness, the depth to our traditions. So the first idea that we're saying here is that why do we escort the dead? Why do we do this? And this is part of the Jewish tradition, that we're not abandoning our loved ones. Okay? And that leads to our next topic of the discussion for today. The cure for the body at the time that precedes the funeral. And I see we have Aubrey with us here. And Aubrey is one of those special people in our community. Aubrey Gamzu, we give a shout out to you, who is one of the volunteers who does Tahara. And I'm sure there are others. So Tahara, there's various laws relating to how we care for the deceased, which we're going to discuss right now. I'm going to put the text up here from the Gemara. What the Gemara tells us, we have two texts here from the Talmud, and let's look at here. The first one says, one who is present at the time of a person's passing is required to tear their clothing. This is because a person's passing is likened to the burning of a Torah scroll. So very interesting here. The law is, and although it's not practiced today except by the immediate family, as you've seen, family members rip kriya, they rip their garment. And we'll discuss more about that in the coming weeks, but just a very simple idea about that is a garment is something that is it's ephemeral, right? It comes, it goes, and we're going to throw it in the garbage afterwards. That's like the body. The body is going to be buried, it's going to decompose, and that's the body. But the soul, we know, is eternal. And that's an expression of that. It's also an expression of our grief. And here we have the text of he says the Ramban, Nachmanides, points to the sacred names of God that are inked onto a Torah scroll's parchment as an analogy for the sacred soul that is installed within the body. What is this saying? We're saying that our body is analogous to a Torah scroll. It's an analogy, okay? The idea is the soul is like the soul is like the letters that contain God's name. All right? So think about it this way, and I think this slide could illustrate the idea very, very easily. A body comes into this world as mere flesh and bones and blood, right? It's just a physical being, which we discussed last week when God created the first human being, dust from the earth, Adam, but it's just physical. Then God breathed into him, into his nostrils, a soul of life. And that's the analogy of the soul is infused in the body just as God's name is inscribed on the Torah scroll. So that's what gives the body its sanctity. It's not just a physical flesh and bones, but it attains its holiness like a Torah scroll that it was parchment before, but now it becomes holy through the sanctity of God's name that's inscribed in it. And this teaches us a very important lesson about the way that we are to handle the body, the way we handle holy things in our life as well. So that's text 9. Text 9 tells us that all who tend to a corpse must be aware that they are handling a holy entity. The human body is more than simply a sheath to a sacred entity, a tool that serves a supernal soul. Rather, it has itself become sanctified with an independent holiness like a Torah scroll. Again, it's a metaphor. Just as we treat a holy Torah with sanctity, we don't say it's just a book, right? We have to realize that the body itself is a holy creation. It's not treated just as anything else. And that's why the Chevra Kadisha and its representatives have a lot of rules and regulations in the way, the great care that they take care of bodies and the great pains that they go to in order to treat the body with the greatest respect. For example, when a tahara is taking place, there are many rules. No casual conversation is allowed in the presence of the deceased. Quiet. It's a holy moment. And at all times, the deceased is covered, even while he's being cleansed. Let me see. I think I have a slide for this as well. So the idea that men tend to the bodies of men and women to women. So let's just go through these ideas. First thing, the body is handled with respect and dignity. So that we discussed. Now, how it's cleaned with the utmost respect, how it's dressed in shrouds, how we never leave the body alone. Do you know there's an idea called of a vacher? A vachter is somebody who's going to be guarding the body from the moment of passing until the person is interred. A person is never abandoned. Never abandoned, not for a moment. Now, of course, ideally, those times should be spent saying Tehillim, but even if Tehillim is not being said, at least a person is not abandoned. And you can see this here in text 10, how we are meant to keep the body, keep a person company after they've passed on. So that is text 10. We did that one already. Let me go here to this. Okay, I think I'm jumping the gun. All right. Another interesting thing. Every part of the body is buried. That's another interesting aspect, including skin, bone fragments, tissue, fluid. They all have to be respectfully buried. So that's why you might notice, you may have seen images of when there were terrorist attacks in Israel, other places in the world. There's an organization called Zaka, which is deployed, and locally we have them as well, to collect any remnants, blood, skin, whatever it might be, fluids. When a person passes on, even the tubes that contain fluids from their body are included in the burial at that time. And that we can see here in text 11. Let me go back to text 11. Sorry. There we are. Text 11. This is Rabbi Moshe Sofer, who is a halachist, a responsa Chassam Sofer. He writes here, there's no differentiation in reverential treatment between complete Torah scroll and a single letter that has become detached from the Torah scroll. Similarly, it is forbidden to handle with disrespect even a single bone that has become detached from a sacred body and that was sacred, that was created in God's image. So because the body retains that special status, we have to treat it with the utmost respect as well. And this leads us to another very important and highly revered Jewish tradition, is what we do with the body. The Torah says, as you can see here in text 12, in the book of Devarim, Ki kavar tikbarena bayamahu. A body should surely be buried, and that's why in Israel, people are buried the very same day as this verse indicates. Outside of Israel, we have to follow local regulations, and not always is that practical. But in Israel, specifically in Jerusalem, a body is not left overnight. People are buried immediately.
If a person dies on Shabbat,
No, not on Shabbat, then Saturday night. The body is muktzah on Shabbos.
That's why.
Okay. King Solomon says in Kohelet and Ecclesiastes, as you can see here in text 13, he says, people proceed to their eternal abodes, and the mourners go about the streets. The dust returns to the earth, v'yashav ha'afar la'aretz kishahaya, v'haruach tashuv el Elokim asher nasana. And the spirit returns to God who bestowed it. We know that a human being is a mere custodian of his body, and therefore the day eventually arrives when the custodian of that body has to return it to God. God takes the soul from us, but it's our task as those left behind to return the body, right? The soul came, it's the godly part. You can't literally hand over a body to God. So what do? We place it in the earth where the body was originally fashioned from. God created Adam, the first human being, from where? From the earth. God formed Adam from the dust of the earth. Right? We read the verse last week, and God breathed into his soul, and not into his nostrils, soul of life. So when God reclaims the breath of life, we return the body to the ground, to the place from which God fashioned the first human being. So that is the idea here. The body comes from the earth, and to the earth it is returned, while the soul goes back above. Let's see this here in text 14, this very idea of how we return. We are the custodians of this body in our lifetime, and how we have to return the deposit. Text 14. This comes from Rabbi Chaim Vital. He was a student of the Arizal. He says, quoting this verse, "For you are dust, and you will return to the dust. The body comes from the earth, and it is entrusted as a deposit to the individual's care. Upon death, the deposit must be returned to the earth from where it came and buried there." And the Torah recounts numerous episodes of burial, all the way from the beginning, when Cain killed Abel. You know what one of my friends told me? You know why he works with a Cain? Because he's not Abel. So, why God, when Cain killed Abel, and their father Adam was mourning, he didn't know what to do. And then the Medrash says that he saw a bird, that he stood there and he witnessed a raven that was burying a fellow bird that had died. And he took this as an indication that he should do the same. That's what the Medrash says. Okay, I'm going to share with you a few references to burial in the Torah, and these are all references. There's many, many more. We're just going to share a few. Avraham went at great lengths to acquire a burial place for Sarah, right? Remember that? Okay, another famous one, actually. Okay, Ruth. Remember, Ruth says, "Where you go, I'll go." Where you the whole list of things she says. Where you lodge, I'll lodge. You people should be my people. Your God will be my God. What's her last line? Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And that our sages also tell us is highlighting the importance of Jewish burial. Okay, so we see that Abraham buys Ma'aras HaMachpelah to bury his wife Sarah. And Yitzchak and Yishmael bury their father Abraham. And Yaakov buries Rachel and his other wives later, right? That is at Keva Rachel in Beit Lechem. And then in Ma'arat HaMachpelah, he himself was buried with his wife Leah and Esav's head. Right? So Yaakov did not want to be buried in Egypt. This is the idea of Jewish burial and why we have Jewish cemeteries. Yosef did not want to remain in Egypt. Remember, Yosef, his last request that his body be returned and buried in the land of Israel. And many years later, that wish was fulfilled. Moshe took his remains out of Egypt, and they were eventually interred in the city of Shechem. I think it's called Nablus today, right? Moshe Rabbeinu, the Torah describes how God himself buried Moshe. Anyone know where?
Nobody knows.
Well, we don't know the geographic location, but the Torah tells us Har Nevo, Mount Nevo. So throughout history, we see the traditional Jewish burial that is known as Kvurat Yisrael, and it was always considered a very high priority, and it's a very important mitzvah. We know the Israeli army today is known to take great risks venturing behind enemy lines to bring the bodies of their fallen comrades back to Israel. We heard a fascinating story last week. We had a visitor, Ilana Yahav, at a Miracle Drive launch event. And she described how in 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, she is a sand artist. So she told us the story with visualizations. She depicted the story in sand. And it was really fascinating. But in 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, where for 8 months they thought her husband was dead. She was pregnant and gave birth to their first child. The kid only met his dad 6 months later. She didn't even know her husband was alive. But she said she had a feeling inside. They sat Shiva for him. But Israel did things to get him back. He was in the Air Force, and his plane was shot down by the Syrians in the Yom Kippur War. He ejected, and he was held hostage by the Syrians, and in some hostage exchange, his body came.
This is in the Jewish report, the recent Jewish
story.
report.
Yeah. So, but unfortunately, the Jewish tradition of burial is seriously threatened these days by a lot of people considering cremation. So I'm not going to go into all the ideas here about cremation. I could tell you I've very seldom had success in preventing cremation. I did have a case last year that I'm very proud of where I prevented a cremation. But this is something that people have to clearly write in their wills and let their families know that they want a Jewish burial and not to wind up in being cremated, as unfortunately many people are doing these days, and it's against Jewish law to be cremated. In Jewish law, we believe that our bodies are not ours. They belong to God, and therefore it is not for us to decide how to inter them. When we bury someone, as per the instruction of the owner, we are just custodians. Our bodies belong to God, and therefore we are affirming our belief in God when we make sure that our bodies are buried and not cremated. Another important point that's described in Jewish law, one of the 13 fundamental principles of Jewish faith, according to Maimonides' Rambam, is belief in the resurrection of the dead and the coming of Mashiach. When we are deciding to be cremated, we are denying our belief in the resurrection and the coming of Mashiach. So therefore, I think it's very important that we should do whatever we can and make sure our family knows that our wish is not to be cremated. Cremation, to some degree, is a rejection of our belief in God's ownership of our bodies, in the holiness of the body, and the belief of resurrection in the future.
I want to ask you, what happens about the people in the Holocaust?
Well, it wasn't their choice. Okay, there's a big difference between when somebody chooses something wrongly, right, and somebody who had no choice in the matter. Okay, so yes, certainly you have a good point about the Holocaust, and there's no doubt that people were, God can resurrect anyone. I'm not saying that people who were cremated won't be resurrected. I don't believe that that's, God certainly will take care of them. But I'm talking here about our choice about what we do. Okay, and it's important that we declare our belief in Hashem, in God's ownership of our bodies. So we realize that cremation isn't just another prohibition. Okay, it's associated with some of Judaism's core beliefs. It constitutes a permanent, this is our belief, and therefore it's important for us to make sure that we deal with ourselves and with others. And I know there are people who think there are ecological issues of why they prefer cremation and other issues. Today they say that actually a natural burial is greener. There are biodegradable caskets and shrouds and all that, and certainly it is something that we should hold in a critical high importance. Okay. All right, there's a few more points that I want to discuss. Let's find them in our book here. Sorry if you don't mind. Apologies. Final text for today. It says in the Talmud, mitzvah l'kayim divrei hames, which means we have an obligation to fulfill the will of a dead person, which is why I emphasize the importance of making sure that you have it clear. And I say this because I had a debate with one of our seniors 13 years ago in 2009, where he told me that he's going to change his will, but he didn't, and his children wanted to fulfill his will, and therefore he wound up being cremated. So I'm telling you that it's important that you put it in writing, you have it in your will. Okay? Yeah?
Filed in your pearls.
Filed in your pearls. Very good. Thank you. And the next text is from Maimonides, Mishnah Torah. He says, though, if a person requested not to be buried, we disregard the request. That's from a Jewish legal perspective. I can tell you, though, in court, it's not so easy to argue. And therefore, I'm telling you why it's important to legally state that will to be buried according to Jewish law. Okay? And in Jewish law, it says that the person really wants, when a person comes on high, the soul really wants to be buried. Well, it doesn't hold weight in court of law. Okay, ladies and gents, our time is up and lunch is waiting for you. But I do have a few more points to cover. Should we go through them or do you want to conclude it here?
Carry on.
Carry on. All right, a few more minutes. Apologies to all those who are watching online. If you're watching us on YouTube after the shiur, we're going a little bit over our time. It's usual. All right, a few very important points and things that people ask me to discuss. So we said that it's a mitzvah to implement the expressed wishes of the deceased. The Mishnah, the Jewish law says if a person requests not to be buried, we could disregard this request. I tell you that legally that's very difficult, and therefore we have to put it into our whatever legal documents that we have. And that's why Jewish law will say administering to Jewish burials, granting what the deceased person wants. Again, that's not so easy to tell a court of law. All right, let's talk here about the final points that we wanted to mention. The interment of the deceased does not spell the end of our connection to the physical remains of our beloved individuals, people who've passed on, and therefore it's important why we continue to visit the gravesite of the deceased. It shows a certain respect for the departed. It shows that their memory was not forgotten. It reinforces our continuing connection to them. That's why people put a stone on the grave to show that there is they weren't forgotten. There's an ongoing connection. And as we read in the text earlier, according to Kabbalah, even as the soul ascends on high, there is a portion of the nefesh that remains connected to the body and the grave, and that's another reason why we will always stay there. We'll always visit them, because the soul is also connected to that space, and you could see this in the words of the Zohar right here in text 16. What does it say? That because the nefesh remains present in the grave, due to the fact that it remains among the living, it is acquainted with their pain. At their time of need, it pleads with God for mercy on their behalf. So our beloved departed are petitioning for us on high. That's why you may have heard that expression people say, especially on a yard site, Zalzaina gute better. They should intercede on our behalf on high. It says the Zohar, when the inhabitants of the world are in need, when they are in sorrow and visit the cemetery, the nefesh is aroused to their plight. It ascends and awakens the ruach, which in turn entreats God for mercy. Consequently, the Holy One, blessed be He, has mercy on the world. So that insight here tells us why people visit grave sites of holy people or of our beloved departed. Because the soul is one entity with the various aspects that we discussed. The nefesh connects with the higher levels of the soul that have ascended to the higher source. And therefore the gravesite is actually a communication port that allows us to commune with the souls above, and also allows us to ask them to intercede before God on our behalf. So that's a very important point. And the mystics tell us that the dead are not only sensitive to the living who visit the cemeteries, but they're also pleased when they receive visitors, that they want us to. So when people visit the grave, as we read here, the nefesh is aroused, the nefesh awakens the ruach, and thereby we have this connection that the ruach entreats God on behalf of the soul. Let's see it here in this text in Sefer Hasidim, text 17, which is our final text that we're going to look at today. It's a story. It says there was once a community that wished to relocate. One of the deceased buried in the vicinity appeared in a dream to a member of the community and pleaded, "Please do not abandon us, for we appreciate your visits to our cemetery." Barzillai the Giladite declared, "I would like to die in my own city." He wished for this because the deceased appreciate when their loved ones visit their graves and request goodness for their souls. This improves their condition in heaven. And when we pray on behalf of the deceased, they pray for us in turn. So, as you could see, the connection is mutual. It goes both ways. And of course, especially on yard sites, there are particular auspicious and propitious times to visit grave sites of our loved ones. Okay, let's quickly recap a lot of what we discussed today. We discussed the soul's departure from this world and the continuing relationship that it has with the people, with us who remain behind. We explained how the soul's disengagement from the body and from the ruach and the nefesh allows us to have a deeper and more essential relationship with our loved ones. We explained how we, those who are here left behind, accompany the soul on its painful journey, and we explained the gradual divestment of the soul from the body, while we mourn with the soul and we comfort it. And then we explained that the special relationship that we have with the deceased includes the body too, which is why we have all the special care that we look after, whether it's a Chaver Kadisha or even funeral etiquette. Okay, it bothers me when I see people chewing gum, dressed inappropriately at funerals. We'll discuss a lot about that in future weeks, but we have to realize how we're meant to be, or even on the phone. Okay, we'll conclude. Actually, you can read this letter for those who have the text. I'm not going to read it, but there's a beautiful letter from the Rebbe here that he describes to Mrs. Chana Sharfstein about when she lost her father, she lost her mother, she lost her mother-in-law, all within a short period, and she wrote a very emotional letter to the Rebbe. So if you have the books, you could read the Rebbe's response to her, which there's a few points that are very important, but we will not have the time to go through them. You have homework, my friends. I want you to do two things. Number one, write down whatever points resonated with you from today's lesson. Okay, and I want you to just think, okay, that was entertaining, that was interesting, that was fascinating. And think about a loved one who you want to strengthen your bond with, and what steps, based on what we discussed today, you could take to do exactly that. Okay. With that, I will put on the key points and we'll conclude today's shir.
Lesson 2. Taking leave. 1. Nefesh and Ruach are two of the soul's components. After death, the Nefesh remains with the body, while the Ruach disengages and ascends to Gan Eden, paradise. 2. Once the Ruach is no longer limited to material existence, it's more accessible to all who wish to connect to it. Thus, when a person dies, our ability to spiritually connect with him or her is stronger and deeper than before. 3. Though the Nefesh remains in the grave, it retains a connection with the higher levels of the soul. The gravesite is thus a portal where we can communicate with departed souls and ask them to intercede before God on our behalf. 4. Over the course of a lifetime, the soul and body integrate and bond. Their separation at death is therefore painful for the soul. 5. The soul departs the body in stages. These stages correspond to the prescribed periods of mourning. When we mourn, we are mourning not only for the deceased, but also with the deceased. 6. Dignity and sensitivity are the underlying principles that guide the care of a corpse and its preparation for burial. This is because even after death, the body retains its special status of having been the container for the soul. 7. Burial is of highest priority in Jewish tradition and culture. When God takes a person's soul, we are tasked to return the body to the place from which God fashioned it. 8. Burial affirms two fundamental Jewish beliefs. A. Our bodies aren't ours. They belong to God. And B. There will be a resurrection of the dead in the Messianic era.
Okay, just on that point, next week, today we discussed this soul's departure from the body from its own perspective. Next week, we will discuss those left behind, us, those who are devastated or are grief-stricken, brokenhearted. What is the Jewish grieving process, which we didn't get to today? What is the significance of the various traditions that we have? That's next week's lesson, and we'll try to provide a meaningful Jewish perspective on grief, the practices of Shiva. I will give you some of my insights and etiquette of Shiva on how to behave in such, when visiting. I could tell you it's awkward, I know. We'll discuss some of these things. I'd love to hear your ideas as well. There was one more point that just came to me when I was watching this last video about, and something we didn't really discuss, about Jewish burial, why many people want to be buried in Israel. And, people have really taken tremendous pains to have their bodies reinterred in Israel, or people have gone to live the end of their life there. That's another interesting topic, but we'll discuss that another time. All questions are welcome now. Take questions, yes. Let's go one at a time. Sorry, go ahead, yeah. I'll take questions from those online afterwards. First, we're going to do those in person. Yes.
Yes, Mom. Has I gone now? I needed to leave them.
All right, I'm muting you all because there we go. Go ahead. Yeah.
What happens to the soul? What happens to the person who's actually under morphine and is not conscious? What happens to the soul then? Is there sort of feeling and then?
No doubt. As long as a person is, first of all, the soul, I guess, is always aware. But as long as a person is alive here in this world, they are considered fully alive, even though they might be on morphine, or maybe even brain damaged. They're fully alive. So is your question about what's with the soul? We're told that as long as the body and soul are still connected, that means
I'm asking about what the person who's dying feels at that.
right. Unfortunately, I can't tell you. From a physical perspective, there's morphine, and from a pathophysiological perspective, that's why we're giving them morphine, because there's pain, there's suffering. From a spiritual perspective, I think the soul also feels the pain. And it's, some say that it might be part of the soul's tikkun, rectification for certain missed opportunities here in this world. I'm not one who can answer it definitively, because I don't know what the soul's actually experiencing them. But I have seen Jewish sources that attribute the pain that we experience at the end of life, that pain and suffering, as a tikkun, as a rectification for certain behaviors in this world, and easing the pain when it reaches on high.
So, whatever state the ill person is, they still pain with that.
Yeah, I think it's painful. I think that the soul feels the body's pain, which we're saying it even feels that after leaving this world, the soul is still pained by the fact that it's no longer here. So in a sense, if the soul is pained by the fact that it's no longer able to do good in this world after it's leaving, in a sense, how much more so it should feel that pain that I'm here in this physical world, and yet I can't achieve, I can't do good, I can't fulfill my mandate, my divine mission here. So again, I'm not speaking definitively, but in my mind would say that that's a painful moment for the soul.
But that's often when somebody's been ill for a long time.
Yeah.
Because they can't be what they used to be.
Exactly. I would say so. I'm just going to turn that off. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question adequately, because I don't know for certain, but that's the way I would see it. Sorry.
Another question.
Yeah?
The mourning process is different for a spouse, for a son. That's what I find difficult.
We'll discuss that next week, okay? So next week we'll go with it in the texts inside. You'll bring your book text, lesson 3. We should go more into detail about the difference in the process. The way I would see it very simply, again, I know this is not definitive. I haven't seen texts on it, sources, but maybe I could look some things up, and also because we're going to discuss it next week. But the fact is, it's part of the 10 Commandments. Honor your father and mother. Your parents brought you into this world. You owe them a certain debt of gratitude, more so than to anyone else. It doesn't preclude you from mourning for a spouse, or God forbid one loses a child, or anyone else deeply. One certainly can. But the commandment, the requirement is for a parent, and in my mind, very simply, the same thing. It doesn't say in the Torah, thou shalt honor your children. It does say honor your father and mother. That's what makes sense to me. Maybe you have a better answer.
This is just a comment.
Yeah,
And I'm here because I really want
sure.
what's going on, but I feel we're rushing through.
It's true. Look, there's 6 weeks, 6 lessons, and there's a lot of information to go through.
I think each lesson should be slower and just be able to take it
Right. I hear you. Okay, it's a good point. I take it. There's a lot of information. There's no doubt. There's a lot of information packed in here. And one can always go back to the videos. There's a lot more information. If you saw the previous screen, if you go to myjli.com, let me just move that up over here. If you go to this, there you go. myjli.com/soul. Can you see it? There's a lot more conversation there. Videos, articles, essays, a lot more information. So you could take what we discussed in this session in almost 2 hours now and continue the conversation online. Okay.
Rabbi?
Sorry, I'm going to do the online questions just now. If you can hold on. We have people in person. So in person will take precedence today. Sorry. Okay, go ahead. Yes, please. True. That's a very good question that you're raising about the need to bury immediately. First of all, the Torah says so. And the verse that we quoted actually was talking about an execution. We're talking about somebody who was executed. They were as a punishment for their transgressions in this world, for certain severe transgressions, and the Torah says that person is to be buried that day. It's considered a dignity. As one who is a paramedic and one who's seen what happens to bodies and the disintegration and the decomposition and the whole entire process, it's not very pretty. And that's one of the reasons about the sanctity and the greatest degree of respect that we treat a body with at the moment of death. That's part of the reason why it is done immediately. Obviously, though, I could tell you our Chaver Kadisha, and I've seen it when my father passed away. In fact, his yard site's next week. 3 years ago, I was standing right here, giving a shiur right here in this very place that I'm standing right now, when I got that phone call from my sister. I didn't even know what she's talking about because I spoke with my father a few hours before. It was that sudden. And the funeral, I thought it was going to happen right away, but it was delayed. I guess it's a matter of weighing up what's a greater respect for the deceased. Is it having more people and family, their loved ones present at the funeral, or an immediate interment? But generally speaking, our Chaver Kadisha's policy is not to delay a funeral more than 72 hours. In Israel, like I said, it's done right away because the Torah says so. So it does feel rushed, but it's out of respect for the deceased. Other questions for anyone who's here in person, then we'll get to the virtual online. Go ahead.
Everything, 99% of what you've said resonates with me. I have huge problems, and maybe I can discuss it privately, with the physical resurrection of the dead. Because if our bodies are going to rise, why is that necessary? If the soul, which is the true essence, has gone to the world to come.
Right. I think that articulates and expresses and highlights the significance, the importance of our bodies. I think that even highlights that the body is not just the conduit, the vessel that houses the soul, but I think it really highlights how significant
will the soul come back?
The body is. Yes, for sure, we'll come back in a body. But again, how that will all work and everything, we'll find out when Mashiach comes. Okay. Yes, Maria.
Yeah, that's what exactly I wanted to echo your last words, is that Zacchaeus Amazing, the resurrection of the dead, is so that those people who have departed can experience the pleasure and joy of the age of Mashiach.
Yeah. Okay, we'll find out when it happens, right? Okay, I'm going to go to some online questions and then we'll go back to in person. So, who was it? Barbara, you wanted to ask something? You can unmute yourself. Barbara? Oh, did I lose you there, Barbara?
I've mute. Okay. Rabbi Cleveman, thanks for an amazing discussion about death, etc. I just want to mention to you, I lost my husband 7 years ago, and everybody says it gets easier, but I have felt it very badly even this year when we had our yortzeit. He passed away after the 2 days of the Seder's. Originally, we couldn't sit Shiva the first week that he passed away, but the second week. And we really had crowds of people coming every day to the Shiva house. We had a massive funeral. But where are half these people in my life today? They come and they sit and they mourn with you. But also I've had a lot of problems with my husband's family. They haven't really been there for me. They've like distanced themselves.
This is being broadcast.
What I've always tried to be there for them. Can you answer me what
Look,
the
I can't
reason
answer for
could be?
individuals, but I can tell you something, Barbara. I found that also somebody was I've encountered this numerous times, and I remember some time ago a lady was very upset with me. She said, "Rabbi, during Shiva, you came, you visited, you comforted us, you led, appreciated the funeral. Where were you afterwards?" And I find the truth is it's probably most difficult for people afterwards. I agree with you. And you mentioned it gets harder. I mean, someone else mentioned that here as well. Why is it that we mourn more for parents than for a spouse? That I will say that I think it depends on the individual. And there's no doubt where you're connected at the hip and you have a deeper connection and relationship sometimes people do with their spouse than with their parents. And it's possible that one can certainly mourn for longer and have certain feelings that not necessarily that they have for their parents. And that's each individual person's journey. But you're right, people should be there for you afterwards. And it's a fault of my own as well. You know what? We lead very hectic, busy lives, and it's no justification, no excuse. It's true. And I think after Shiva is when people need all the more support. Because during Shiva, we have a support system. And the support system is that Jewish law requires that we visit, that we comfort, that we offer solace. And then afterwards is where we sort of have a much harder time. So there's no doubt we could offer a lot more support, and there's no doubt that it's a more difficult time. But Barbara, why don't you come join us here at Chabad? It will certainly make it a little bit easier being with friends.
Definitely, Rabbi. I'm going to start coming, even if it's once a month. I did come to a few years ago before COVID, but I'm going to make an effort to come in person.
We look forward to seeing you, Barbara. Any other questions?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, and in person? All right, there's a delicious lunch waiting for everyone. All the best. Thank you for joining us. Please be back next week. Next week's lesson, the morning after, is exactly what you're talking about, Barbara. And I think everyone will appreciate that. You know, that's exactly what we're addressing, the grief, the mourning, how to console, comfort people afterwards. Especially, I mean, we're going to talk about Jewish law, which is the Shiva and the Shloshim and the year, but also how to deal with afterwards. So see you all next week, please God. All the best. Thank you for joining.